I'm George Galloway. I'm one of the founders of No2Nato, No to War, which has swept the anti-war movement throughout the Western world and really made a dent on public consciousness, particularly in the last week, which I shall describe in just a minute. But our philosophy is very clear. We wish to gather everyone under that banner, no to war, no to NATO. We don't care what their other politics are. We don't care if we like each other or we hate each other, for this simple reason that no to war nowadays is an existential matter. When two superpowers, nuclear armed, hypersonically powered, are squaring up for a war, that means the entire planet and all of humanity stands in mortal danger, making all other political differences pale, visibly pale into insignificance. So for anyone who says, why is he appearing with she or she appearing with him? Why are they on the same platform? That is the reason. And we make no apology for it. There's no sectarianism here. There's no litmus test. There's no ideological blood test. You don't get shadow banned here in No to NATO, No to War. If you have a voice and something to say and can eloquently express it, as all of my speakers here this evening can do, you are welcome on a No to NATO, No to War platform and indeed broadcast. Well, when I said last Sunday, it seems like an aeon ago now, but is not even a single week, that we had reached an inflection point in the war. Little did I know just how apposite that description would turn out to be. Early on Sunday morning, I put out a tweet saying the last straw, atop a clip from the Canadian Parliament itself of a rapturous, orgiastic frenzy of joy from every single member of the Canadian Parliament, bar none. And every single one of the invited guests, some of whom turned out to be very interesting indeed, bar none, for a Waffen SS veteran, a war criminal by definition, because the Nuremberg Tribunal condemned the SS as a criminal organization. Ipso facto, every member of it was a war criminal. And the individual, 98 years old, that they were greeting so rapturously in the Canadian Parliament, had a history so grisly that now Wikipedia are considering it for deletion. That's the way history is agreed upon amongst the liars. The 98-year-old killer, pogromist, participator and enabler of the Holocaust in the East, which killed millions of people, Polish Jews and other Polish people, Ukrainian Jews and other Ukrainian people, partisans captured fighting the Nazi invasion of Operation Barbarossa, ordinary civilians in Ukraine that would not kowtow and collaborate with the invading and occupying Nazi forces, were all murdered in significant part by the regiment that this individual, being greeted in the Canadian Parliament, had volunteered to join. He volunteered to join one of the most notorious, heinous, infamous group of mass murderers that the world has ever known. And there he was, large as life, in the Canadian House of Commons. His reception was part of the mass hysteria which has gripped the political class throughout the Western world. A mass hysteria that Russia and Russians are bad even if they died centuries ago. And anyone who fights Russians, whenever they fought them, and on whose behalf they fought them, is good and is to be honored. And in scenes that will live forever, whatever Wikipedia deletes, whatever the Hansard of the House of Commons in Canada decides, and they are seriously debating now whether to excise the entire episode from the parliamentary record, forgetting that this is 2023 and these scenes are indelibly etched into the minds of hundreds of millions of people around the world and will never be forgotten. That's what I call an inflection point, all right. My tweet has now 7 million impressions. It was the first global expression of outrage, and it quickly spread to Canada, though not quickly enough for the Canadian mainstream media to actually report on it. I had a caller on the mother of all talk shows last night from Canada to say he had learned of these events from the mother of all talk shows last Sunday evening. He had to tune into a program being hosted by a Scotsman in London to know what had happened in his own parliament. The mainstream media in Canada took 72 hours to report what I tweeted on Sunday morning. But they can't ever now be allowed to forget it. And I don't believe that the mass audience that were impacted by these events will ever forget it either. I believe that the narrative has changed. The game has changed. This is news from the front line. We are not, of course, fighters on the front line, but we are, all of us, fighters on the information war front line. And a decisive advantage has just passed to us. And a number of salient points emerge from the whole affair, which is, I remind you, not even yet a week old. The first is that the narrative we have been enunciating over the last 500 days and more, that part of the reason for the need to decisively defeat this regime in Kiev is that it is infested by Nazis and by Nazism. The second is that Canada and North America as a whole has a real Nazi problem. Thousands of Nazis were shipped to Canada at the end of the Second World War by Britain. Britain drew up a list called the Rimini List. It was drawn up in Rimini in Italy, then under Allied occupation, which specified which Nazis would go where in the Western world. Of course, the United States took the creme de la creme, the scientists, the rocket engineers, and the people that they knew that they would need. But Canada got a very significant number. 10,000 Nazis were shipped to Canada. And that 10,000 in the generations since has become scores of thousands, to the point that Ukrainians now constitute 5% of Canada's total population. One of the reasons why certain politicians in Canada have been so gung-ho for the war and so slavishly pro-Zelensky, who was equally honored rapturously last week in the Canadian Parliament. And very few of the sons and daughters, grandsons, granddaughters, now great-grandsons and great-granddaughters in Canada seem to have disavowed the ideology and the actions of their forefathers. So you have a sizable constituency. You have organizations of veterans of the SS in Canada. You have monuments, shrines, and all kinds of public furniture dedicated to the memory of people who are very lucky they weren't put up against a wall and shot by firing squad for their crimes against humanity, for their war crimes at the end of the Second World War. But the third thing is that the rest of us have a Nazi problem too. It ought to be well known that the first head of NATO was himself a Nazi general. It ought to be well known, but isn't, that a Nazi general, an SS general, Kurt Waldheim, became the Secretary General of the United Nations itself. It ought to be well known that there are Nazis and people who pray in that direction are seeded throughout NATO and throughout the infrastructure of Western political life. It ought to be well known that we have been funding and arming and proselytizing for literally Nazi battalions inside the Ukrainian armed forces throughout this entire conflict. And it ought to be well known, but is not yet well enough known, that for 8 long years before Russia's special military operation, these Nazi forces were committing genocide against Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the eastern part of the country, and that lies at the heart of the conflict which has proved so expensive in blood and treasure for all of us, but particularly for the Ukrainians over this last year and a half. The dying is done by Ukrainians and Russians, but the decisions are made by the Western governments, and particularly the government of the United States of America with its most loyal satraps, Germany and the United Kingdom being close behind in their zealotry for this mass killing. The good news is none of this will be as hard to prove now as it was before last week. The ball is burst. The narrative is burst. The quietude on these questions is burst. Even now in Canada, where the advantage has shifted decisively towards us and against Trudeau and Freeland and the others in his gang. The good news is that no one will ever look askance again when we tell them that Russia is not the criminal in this story, that the criminals are us, that the war party is us, that this war was created by and is continued by not Russia, but us. We are the baddies. In the past, until last week, that was a difficult stone to push uphill against a tidal wave of fake news, falsification, and the suppression of our alternative point of view. But it will not be such a steep hill to push that stone up any further. Enough from me for the moment. We have a galaxy of important and now increasingly well-known speakers to address you at this rally online this evening. The bright star that is Patrick Henningsen of 21st century wire has been in this seat over the last few weeks when I have been absent with leave from No2Nato, No2War. Patrick, with his calm, considered, analytical, devastating approach is the first speaker this evening. Patrick, welcome back to No to War.
Thank you, George. It was great to be here.
What's the big point for you from the front line?
Well, I'm very, like you've just laid out incredibly well, George, in your opening monologue. I think the tide is definitely shifting here. There's this confluence of events, call them gaffes, call them things that we've all been talking about. We've been raising the alarm about all of this craziness for like the last 18 months and really the last 10 years. But to see it happening now, there's a couple of things. This scene in Canada, this midnight Nuremberg rally hosted by Justin Trudeau and Zelensky with Chrystia Freeland, whose own grandfather herself was a chief propagandist for Joseph Goebbels. Those are all facts. But as you said, George, we've been shouting about these things from the rafters and nobody's listening, or they're telling you it's a conspiracy theory, or why are you talking like this? Now that's cat's out of the bag. But there was this ecstasy in the eyes of the people in the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa that is unmistakable. There was an adulation there. Why they were venerating this Waffen-SS veteran, and the news commentators in the Canadian Broadcasting Company, when they're doing the solemn commentary explaining it on the news, you could hear them saying, and he helped to liberate Ukraine from Russia. And then at that point you knew, and I think I think this was intentional, George, in the sense that they knew who this person was. At least the top brass did. But I really, truly believe, George, and I know I'm probably giving him a wide berth here, but a lot of politicians and people in the media, they are really clueless about history. They don't understand any of this. They've been swept away with this narrative on this tsunami of virtue signaling for the last 18 months. And when somebody is presented like that to them, they wouldn't be able to put two and two together, thinking who was fighting the Russians in the Second World War. Well, in Ukraine, it could only have been one counterparty. And of course, that's Nazi Germany. So I really think this speaks to the lack of education, the ignorance, the total delusionality that seems to be completely pervasive in the G7 zone, in NATO governments and so forth. They really don't understand. They don't know. Now they do. So we actually have to, we owe them a debt of gratitude for this gaffe, because this is a really important turning point. The other point of embarrassment, George, was the outing of this American trans English language military spokesperson, Sarah Ashton Cirillo, formerly Michael John Cirillo, whose propaganda, who's threatening Western journalists who they call Russian propagandists. This got the attention of the U.S. State Department. It's huge embarrassment. This person's kind of attracting all the wrong attention, and also probably making a lot of people uncomfortable in places like Germany and other polite society in Europe and the UK. But that's also a huge point of embarrassment. And not only that, but for the Ukrainian people themselves. I think this whole scene with Zelensky there, with Trudeau, the Ashton Cirillo affair, plus the United States government, the shutdown in terms of the economic budget arguments, which happens every 6 months, as you know, with the deficit spending running out of control as normal fare in the United States. But now they've attached the Ukraine issue to this. And so while the money that they send to Ukraine in itself is not going to break the bank of the U.S. Federal Reserve in their deficit spending sprees, but it's emblematic of a wedge issue. It's risen to the level of wedge issue. And this is really important. So all these three things, this confluence of events, it gives politicians an excuse to look for the exit. And no one else shows this in perfect form than Poland. So Poland, the truth be known, the public face of Poland has always been absolute shoulder to shoulder with the government, with Ukraine from the beginning. They've been very hospitable. They facilitated a U.S. military buildup in that part of the country, making it the kind of new Germany in a way. That's the way it was looking like it was heading. But there were fissures there, and those fissures were deep. The Polish public are not keen to fight Russia in a third world war. So this incident in Canada allowed them the excuse they needed to take a step back in order to turn down the temperature a little bit. So the honeymoon phase with Ukraine, with all of these state actors, is now gone. That phase is over. The thrill is gone. And now we're down to the reality of it. And the reality is there is no military path for Ukraine going forward. People are starting to realize it, but then there's the liability of all the associations with these radical ideologies like Nazism, which is rife in institutions in Ukraine, has been that way for a very long time, but is really been allowed to grow because it's been armed and funded by NATO, by the United States. And once again, George, the United States and its partners have shown to be very adept at backing those with radical ideologies, the most extreme is partnering with them, whether it's the Mujahideen and Al-Qaeda, you could even say ISIS, we might even throw into that category, arguably. But here they are again in history. They always partnered. In fact, they've been grooming and watering and feeding the radical Ukrainian nationalist movement since the Second World War, truth be known. And that's declassified. This isn't anything that we even need to prove. It's in the Library of Congress. And there's plenty of documents that you can Google right now to show that's the case. And Canada is probably one of the worst offenders in this. But the United States and Canada and the Five Eyes have been able to manage this because they saw always Ukraine would be the soft underbelly in which to weaken and attack the Soviet Union during the Cold War. But what happened, George, at the end of the Cold War? We were supposed to dismantle all of these things and get back to normal relations, but no, they ramped it up at the end of the Cold War, and that's the problem. And this is why we're in the situation that we're in right now.
It's funny, with Five Eyes at their disposal, they couldn't see who was standing in the gallery and to whom they were offering their rapturous reverence. Thank you, Patrick, as always. Laurie Spencer is another longtime colleague of mine. She's a journalist, a broadcaster, an analyst, a television personality, but she's no to NATO, no to war, and she is welcome here. Laurie, Patrick peerlessly described there the midnight Nuremberg rally that went on just north of where you are in Ottawa. Were you surprised by it, first of all? Did you see it in real time as a tremendous gaffe, or did you see it as a logical conclusion of the path that Western leaders and Trudeau in the van have been on?
Well, first of all, George, thanks for having me back. Yes, we were on the air live Friday on Maverick News. I'm the American correspondent for Maverick News. Maverick News is a Canadian news network based in Ontario, and we were carrying live the stream of Zelensky's visit to the Parliament. And when the speaker introduced Yaroslav Hunka, he introduced him as someone who was fighting the Russians in World War II, and that gave me pause. Yeah, because I know who fought the Russians in World War II, and I said, wait a minute. But we were live on the air, so I didn't want to say anything until I'd researched this man, and I spent Saturday finding out who he was. And yes, he was in the Waffen-SS Galicia Division. So we went with the story on Sunday. And as far as I'm aware, I think we were the first news outlet in Canada to report that story. Strangely enough, the mainstream media was silent about it until it went viral on social media, and there was so much public outrage, rightly so. So yeah, that's how we found out. We had it live on the air when it happened. But in my research,
it's big news, Laurie, on social media. But did it make the mainstream?
Not in Canada, and it took a while in the United States as well. There was a strange delay in reporting that story. Gee, I wonder why.
You see, that's peculiar to me, Laurie, because I don't want to be offensive to Americans, but one of our pet hates over here is the proliferation of Second World War films which show John Wayne winning the war, show Americans winning the war, which for a start they didn't enter until it was 2 years old. And secondly, it was the Russians, not the Americans, that won the war. But these are Western societies for whom the Second World War is apparently important. The defeat of Hitler is the great achievement of 20th century government in Western countries. And yet, here was a member of the Five Eyes, a British Commonwealth country, a member of NATO, a leading liberal progressive prime minister, hailing a mass murdering SS man. And yet, none of them, certainly in Britain, none of the mainstream media have made this an issue at all.
Shameful. Absolutely shameful. And there's a lot of scrubbing of the internet also happening right now. And, as you just said, the Canadian Parliament is looking to strike the whole thing from the record. So something I found in my research, and it's what I wanted to bring to you today, and this has been very much covered up in the news, is that Jaroslav Honka wrote his own memoir and he published it on the internet. It was a blog that he published in 2011, and he told his story of what it was like in World War II and why he joined the Waffen-SS. I wanted to read you a few selected excerpts, if I may, because
Please.
I think this blog is about to go away. It's going to be memory hold. And I want to read these excerpts into the permanent record so that if the blog goes away, his words will live forever. He writes, the Polish army and the civilian population are fleeing along the road in the direction of Berezan in a continuous stream, and German planes are catching up with them from time to time. And here he's describing his youthful fantasies about killing Polish civilians. He says, every day we impatiently looked in the direction with the hope that these mystical German knights who give bullets to the hated cowards will appear. He's, of course, writing of the Nazis. He says, in my 6th grade, out of 40 students, there were 6 Ukrainians, 2 Poles, and the rest were Jewish children of refugees from Poland. We wondered why they were running away from such a civilized Western nation as the Germans. He goes on to describe the Nazi invasion of Ukraine, of course, Operation Barbarossa. He writes, in July of 1941, the German army occupied our town. We greeted the German soldiers with joy. He writes of Hitler, the new liberator of the Ukrainian people. Führer Hitler reigned over our land. Portraits of Hitler in a long overcoat with a raised cowl covering his menacing face, with small, as if artificially attached whiskers under his sharp nose, with the inscription, Hitler, Liberator, hung in each classroom in every school. He writes of the OUN, the notorious OUN. He says, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists organized its cells in our local gymnasium at our school and embraced many young people. I had just turned 16, and the next 2 years were the happiest years of my life. That's how he describes being under Nazi occupation. He says, I had no idea what I experienced in those 2 years would fill me with love in such a way that it would be enough for me for the rest of my life. And then in 1943, Honka's dream of joining the Waffen-SS came true. He says, the thought of turning those beasts in human form with a red star on the forehead became real. That's how he writes of the Red Army. He says, time and events said that it was my generation's turn to follow in the footsteps of its predecessors. And it went for the sake of the idea of cathedral Ukraine. Our roads were different because that was the fate of our stateless people. At the call of the OUN, many joined the ranks of the UPA. Others, at the call of the Ukrainian Central Committee, went as volunteers to the Galishnia Division. In 2 weeks, 80,000 volunteers joined the division, including many students of my school. None of us asked what our reward would be, what our provision would be, or even what our tomorrow would be. We felt our duty to our native land, and we left. He talks about how the Red Army mowed down his division. He says, many students of my local gymnasium died a heroic death in the ranks of the UPA in the Galishnia Division. Of the Holocaust, he says very little. He says, I do not want the reader to understand that my entire generation was ideologically motivated and spiritually conscious. In a bag of healthy apples, there are also some rotten ones. It will depend on the relationship between those two qualities of apples in the course of a generation. Of course, on the last day of the war, the Galishnia Division broke off contact with the Czechoslovak Republic and surrendered to the British Army, he writes in his blog. And then he gets a lucky break when he was found to be useful, most likely by British military intelligence. He writes, in a prisoner of war camp in Italy, I met many boys from various villages of my region, and he recounts that many of his fellow prisoners were old friends from the OUN and the UPA. It was like a reunion party of his former Waffen-SS Galicia division. Hunka remained unapologetic in his 2011 online memoir, still proud of his service in the Waffen-SS and still very smitten with Ukrainian nationalist fanaticism. He writes of it as some kind of twisted mission from God and bizarrely compares himself to the Jews who fled to Israel after the war. Now, he fails to mention, of course, that the Jews were fleeing persecution while he was fleeing prosecution when he immigrated to Britain and later Canada. He says, I think that it was God's will that we should travel around the world like the tribe of Israel, tell the world about Ukraine, and 45 years later come to it with help. Our mission was difficult, he says, because the world knew very little about us, and what it did know, it was falsely presented by our neighbors. End quote.
Well, it is chilling indeed. You can see why they want to memory hole it. The SS in toto was declared by the Nuremberg Tribunal to be a criminal organization. That's right. Ipso facto, he was therefore a criminal. But he was deemed to be useful. And useful he turned out to be, I'm sure, until last week, until his unmasking, uncorked all over again the incipient hatred of people for fascism, for Nazism, and the bringing back of memories which had faded too far of the crimes of these people. Babi Yar, the mass murder of more than 100,000 people, most of them Jews, in pits, where they were alive and then they were slaughtered in the pit in which they were then entombed forever, was carried out by these Ukrainian nationalists, these very people. Hunka may even have been there. Why not? It was his division that carried it out. Laurie Spencer, as always, thank you very much indeed for that. Let's go to our last speaker, Neil McCrae, another old colleague of mine, We've been on many a television show together on Kalimahorra, on the Lebanese station Al Mayadeen. Niall is a trade union official, but also an author and social commentator, and a very fine one at that. Dr. Niall McCrae, welcome to No2Nato, No to War. What was your big takeaway from the last week or so?
Well, I think if you live by the woke sword, you're going to die by it at some point or other. I mean, as the whole thing about wokeness gets more and more absurd, and when we talk about woke, George, we tend to think about what's going on with the the trans agenda and some of the critical race theory and critical gender theory and all that sort of thing. But I believe that Trudeau prancing around on the world stage has exhibited a very woke approach to the war in Ukraine. He's made it very much a moral narrative, and of course that's what woke is. It's pushing a moral narrative, what I would say is an immoral narrative, but that's what certainly younger generations are taught. That they're indoctrinated, brainwashed into seeing the world as this divide into good and bad. And of course, with the Ukraine war, Russia is bad, Putin is bad, evil, and Ukraine and Zelensky are sanctified. I think Canada has got almost a unique place in the kind of woke modern world, because for a while it's been a safe haven for terrorists and extremists. Senior Nazis after the Second World War, ethnic and religious radicals, criminal fugitives, and now subversive gender activists. And yet Trudeau, after this, what's seen as a gaffe, he has a lot of interest in using this smear of fascism and Nazism, and any opponent of his must be far right. And it got worse than that with the truckers convoy, didn't it? When these men and their supporters, just ordinary people chipping in $10 or whatever, were criminalized. They were treated as domestic terrorists, and Tamara Lich and one of the other organizers is going through trials at the moment simply for organizing a peaceful protest. But the thing about woke Puritans, like Trudeau, are that they are everything they accuse you of. It's all a massive projection. So when they call you far right, and even you, George, now gets called far right, they're saying that you're beyond the pale, that you're immoral, deeply immoral, and that people should disassociate themselves from you. It's a cancel culture, isn't it? In fact, it is they who are the really hateful, intolerant people. And that's been shown very much with this war in Ukraine, with the way that just ordinary Russian people, or even dead Russian people, Tchaikovsky's a concert in Cardiff was cancelled. A great composer from like pre-Soviet times. And the purpose of woke ideology is to divide and rule. And Trudeau knows that a lot of people do not support, I may have the number wrong here, but it's something like $13 billion of Canadian taxpayers' money has gone on fighting this war in Ukraine. And he knows that many people are aghast at that. Canada might be a rich country, but it's got lots of social problems, as indeed any developed country has now, because poor people are not being looked after by their governments anymore. The government looks at them with disdain or total neglect while spending money on their ideological projects. And as you've pointed out this week, George, this isn't just a problem of neo-Nazis in Ukraine. This is actual Nazis going back to the, as the Laurie, the previous speaker said, the armed resistance in Ukraine, fighting with the Waffen-SS in the Second World War. But we shouldn't judge people too much on their parents or grandparents. But Chrystia Freeland, as you say, the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, her grandfather was a chief propagandist for Hitler. Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum, his father produced flamethrowers for the Wehrmacht. Not a well-known fact. The program lives on. The Nazi program lives on. It's a program of totalitarian technocracy, willingly facilitated by faux liberal dictators such as Justin Trudeau.
It's funny, I think it was Oscar Wilde, it might have been Bernard Shaw, who said, the more they talked of their honor, the faster I counted my spoons, for they were undoubtedly stealing them in the days when spoons were made of silver. The more they talk of their virtue, the more they talk of their liberalism and their progressivism, the more it becomes clear that they are the most authoritarian, hateful, intolerant people anywhere to be found in the world, and now no longer shy even of openly demanding that one be silenced, that one not be in polite company, but be silenced, and so that no one can ever hear them again. Some liberalism that, Dr. Niall.
Yes, indeed. And our big challenge on alternative media, if we can call it that, is to try and wake people up, because too many people, I'd still say the majority of society just doesn't understand what this climate con, this net zero scam is about. They don't understand what this trans subversive gender ideology is about. They don't understand what the pandemic totalitarianism is about. They just see governments doing what they can in response to situations. Ukraine's been invaded by nasty Putin, and if we don't stop it now, he'll be, his tanks will be reaching the French coast before long. People don't join the dots. And this is our big challenge, is to try and get people to understand that what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on with global boiling, as they call it, what's going on with the World Health Organization and the World Economic Forum, is all part of the same agenda. And someone at Trudeau's level, or Jacinda Ardern, or Dan Andrews, some of these leaders have now thankfully left, but they will know what this is really about. So their performance is staged. They are knowingly lying to the people. And I believe that this 98-year-old Ukrainian who was fighting with the Nazis, I believe Trudeau knew that. He knew this wasn't a gaffe. He thought that he could get away with it, because I think one of the things that they do, these tin pot dictators like Trudeau, is they always have a dual purpose to what they're doing. One is that they have the simple message that goes out to the masses who just believe it. They know they just see this Ukrainian war hero and think brilliant. But they know that there's 15 to 20% of critical thinkers who do know what's going on, who would know that a Ukrainian who was fighting the Red Army in the war was fighting for the Nazis. And they do that as well because they're rubbing it in. They're trolling us. But unfortunately for Trudeau, this is very much backfired.
It has, Dr. Niall, as always. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Let me go back to Patrick Henningsen, if I may. It has come to something, Patrick, that the only defense these Canadian politicians have got is that they are incredibly stupid. Will this have any impact on their prospects of continuing in office?
Yeah, it's not exactly handicapping, is it, these days, George? In politics, yeah, I mean, that's not going to shock any of the Canadian electorate either. Unfortunately, Canada has this first past the post system, so I don't know how many decades it's been since there's been a leader that has more than 50% of the vote. Trudeau got 32%, I think, of 60% eligible that actually came out to vote in the last election. Hardly a mandate, but with the coalition they stitched together at the 11th hour, there he is again, once again. But I think this is a bridge too far. I think this is going to haunt him for a very long time because his brand has always been the virtue signaling, the latest thing, the current thing. He's always been sort of with it on the trends. So I think this is going to be long-term devastating for him. I mean, in his mea culpa, George, it said it all. He basically said, I'm sorry. The speakers apologized as if he himself doesn't take any responsibility for it. And then he says, we must guard against Russian propaganda and disinformation, literally in the same breath. That tells you really, I think, all you need to know about this cluster B personality sociopath. Sorry, I'm being kind. There's other things that have been said about him. But you know what's amazing about this is the final comment on this, George, is that, see, the opportunity in Ukraine by setting the stage, by engineering the events and the conditions to bring Russia, to bait Russia into a special military operation on February 24th, 2022. Okay, this allowed, and this is why I think this was engineered to absolute perfection, because they knew that they were losing the public opinion on expeditionary wars and humanitarian interventions over the years. They absolutely crashed with Iraq. Libya is a unmitigated disaster for Europe as well. That's directly at NATO's feet. Syria, the proxy war in Syria, and Yugoslavia, and the list goes on and on. This having Russia intervene allowed all these Western countries to absolve them of all of their past sins. This is why they've been almost evangelical about Putin's war of choice. You know, the tropes are there, like at the top of every heading. Putin's war of choice, Russia's war of aggression, etc. This allowed them to absolve them of all of their sins and to rekindle their love affair with international law. All of a sudden becomes relevant in U.S. discourse, political discourse, and on the media as well, who also are a partner to all of these undeclared illegal wars of aggression over the years at the hands of NATO, the United States, and Britain mainly. But this allowed them to do that and to rediscover their morality. And this is why this is what the excitement's about, because it's literally a chance to be reborn, in their eyes anyway, in the eyes of the Western public, to be legitimate once again. And they could then wage these moral crusades around the world in service of democracy and liberty. Okay, so I think that this is one of the main motivators, because let's face it, NATO's record is really, really bad. And half the world's leaders are probably looking at it like, why does it even exist in 2023? And it's given them a raison d'etre. And that's why I think they've clung to this issue. They're waving the Ukrainian flag ceaselessly because somehow they believe that this is the path to salvation for them.
Laurie Spencer, in the United States, you're blessed. In Britain and Canada, both the governments and the opposition are completely evangelically in support of NATO and the war. But in the United States, you have now not one but two serious candidates running for the presidency who are completely against this war and will end it if they, or end their country's involvement in it if they are elected. How did that come to pass that the anti-war side in the US is stronger than it is virtually anywhere else?
I don't know if that's saying much, George. We still can't get enough people in the streets here in the United States. Of course, we had the Rage Against the War Machine rally back in February and had a respectable crowd, but not nearly enough people. And still, when you look at our Congress, every time there's a funding package for Ukraine, the majority vote for it. There is, some opposition to the war. Strangely enough, on the Republican side, not a single Democrat is opposing the war except Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Yeah, but Trump and Kennedy are both making a significant part of their election campaign, which means, unless they're fools, that they think this has public traction, that the voters can be won to that position. And I'm pretty sure that they are right about that, not least because just like downtown Vancouver could do with some of the money that's been spent on Ukraine, every main street in America, every bridge, every highway could do with some of the 130 billion that's been sent to Ukraine. So the economic as well as the geostrategic issues are beginning to mature quite well. It's not long, until the American presidential election. Laurie, last word from you.
I just want to say that what Niall said was absolutely correct. Trudeau might play dumb, but he knew exactly who Yaroslav Hunka was. In fact, Hunka's daughter-in-law posted a photograph on Facebook of Yaroslav Hunka sitting in the private quarters of Justin Trudeau last Friday in his wheelchair, waiting to meet privately with Trudeau and Zelensky. And that is why Zelensky's been strangely quiet, and so has Deputy Prime Minister Freeland. And Trudeau must resign. Freeland must resign. And I think that all 338 members of their parliament should resign as well.
Definitely. Every cloud has a silver lining, Laurie. If not for what happened last week, Chrystia Freeland would have been the next Secretary General of NATO. She certainly ain't going to be now. Dr. Neil McCrae, last word to you before I wrap the meeting up. It's been a top meeting, I would say. What about the British? As I said, the so-called opposition is lockstep with the government on the war and on sending desperately needed public expenditure to a war thousands of miles away from us, over whether or not Kupiansk should be on one side of a line on a map in a country of which we know little, when it's been on different sides of different lines many times in the last 100 years. It's quite a feat to win both the government and the opposition to unquestioning support for such an enterprise. Is that going to hold? Is there any possibility of the British people falling out of love with their government and their opposition, not least because of this subject?
Well, again, I would draw a comparison to climate change. So we've got this clamor for net zero, and it's not just at national government level. Every council, city and county council up and down the country, and it's the same across the West, but just talking about the British experience for now, is that you get citizens turning up to council meetings, and what they hear is just almost, it's like a parallel universe where every single one of the councillors appears to believe, and that's not just Labour and Conservative and Liberal Democrat and Green, it's the independents as well. Every single one of them seems to believe that there is an urgent climate crisis, and they speak all the language of net zero and I need to do this, need to do that. And that's the way they've been on Ukraine. 650 MPs in Westminster. Now, if you look at the COVID, there's a few MPs now that are speaking out against the COVID regime and the iatrogenic harm caused by that regime. But that's a small minority. You've got hardly anyone who would dare say they don't believe in a climate emergency. And with Ukraine, it's almost, I don't think there's been a single MP who said we should stop funding this war in Ukraine. But again, drawing the contrast with climate change, what we're now seeing with these net zero policies, with the road charging, with blocking roads, 20 miles an hour speed limits and all that sort of thing. I mean, in Wales, there's a huge backlash. And it cannot be ignored. It cannot be ignored. And I think that scheme will be scrapped. So we're starting to see real pushback now, real resistance. There's a momentum. And when people join the dots, because that's the crucial thing here, people need to join the dots. And when they join the dots and see that their health services, their social services, their all the things that they're used to getting in their towns and communities are not being funded anymore. Where is the money going? Well, a lot of it is being sunk into this money laundering scheme in Ukraine. And once people realize that, and once they properly begin to understand why this is being done, then we'll get some real resistance, and hopefully then we'll get good size marches on the streets.
Dr. Niall McCrae, author and social commentator, Laurie Spencer, journalist and historian, and Patrick Henningsen of 21st Century Wire, thank you for joining us on this No to NATO, No to War rally. And I ask the audience, whether watching now live or later, to make sure that you follow No to NATO, No to War on all the social media platforms to boost our numbers. Make a donation to the organization if you possibly can, and above all, spread the word about this great global movement that is gathering strength and gathering force to make a decisive change in the way we do things here in the NATO West. I've been George Galloway. You've been a marvelous audience. Thank you for joining us, and join us again for the next rally in 2 weeks' time. Good night.